as I am a specialist of Silla, and I'm an unrepentant lover of Silla, which is not necessarily popular in Korea. But to me, I mean, Korean culture derives from Silla because the language we have, so much of the culture, the information that we have so much more about Silla than we do anything else.
Well, I play the Silla song all the time. You know, to my point of view, the thing I've been talking about is the peaceful thread throughout Korean history that goes counter to what most Koreans think about their own history. But this is not a peaceful time. 안녕하세요, this is Prof Peterson with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center. And today we have a guest you've met before, but it's been 2 years, I think.
More than that.
3 years, maybe. Anyway, it was a video that we did on the Three Kingdoms, and it's had a lot of views. It's one of my top 5. Today, we've got a special reason for meeting, and that is Rick has a new book that has just come out, and we want to publicize it and talk about it and tell people they ought to buy it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for inviting me to the show, Mark. There are a couple of different ways that you can purchase this book. You can, the book is distributed by the University of Chicago Press. So you can just type the title of the book, you know, The Three Kingdoms of Korea, you know, into your search engine, and it can take you to, you know, you go to the Reaction Books website.
That's the publisher.
That's the publisher, but they're out of London, but it's distributed by the University of Chicago Press.
In the United States.
In the United States. But you can also get copies off Amazon.
Tell me about it then, yeah.
Well, this book is part of a series that's published by Reaction Books that deals with lots of earlier civilizations, and so
thus the title Lost Civilization.
Lost Civilization. So it's part of a series, and I've been in Korea and talked about this book, and they want to know what Lost Civilization has to do with it.
Oh.
You know, to Koreans, you know, the ancient, you know, Three Kingdoms of Korea isn't a lost civilization.
No.
Although in a lecture I gave in Korean, I was explaining how we could think of this as a lost civilization, because there are many things about Three Kingdoms civilization which are very different from Korea today.
Yeah.
And so, but you know, they're the Aztecs and the Etruscans and the Goths and the Greeks, the Hittites, right? There are books. What's interesting is rather than just saying the Koreans, you know, they wanted the Three Kingdoms of Korea in part. And I think, you know, what people know about Korea, especially now, is starting in the early 2000s, there have always been these interesting historical dramas. You know, there was Jumong, and there was Queen Sunduk, right? There were these dramas, and there was the Hwarang a few years ago, back in 2017. And what's interesting is I had to, you know, make up kind of a project to explain to them what I hope to do. And I said, well, when we talk about the Three Kingdoms of Korea, we're talking about early Korea. And there aren't 3 kingdoms, but there's really kind of 5 in some ways. But in Korea and Korean scholars, we talk about this broad period from roughly the 1st century before the Common Era, 1st century BC, to about the 10th century of the Common Era, 10th century AD.
First 1,000 years.
The first 1,000 years. This is that period. And, you know, because of the Samguk-sagi, the history of the Three Kingdoms, and the Samguk-yusa, memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, this whole period is known as the Three Kingdoms period.
And that's a common way to look at it. Although one of my favorite trick questions I ask is how many kingdoms were there in the Three Kingdoms period? And I always like to answer 4, because I like to include Gaya. But as you said, there were 5 or 6. You could count some of the other northern Buyeo and some of the other ones.
Well, the ones that I'm thinking of, right, are, you know, definitely including Gaya.
You talk about Gaya.
And I talk about Gaya because you really can't understand Silla. And in some ways, you really can't understand early Korea and its connection with Japan, early Japan, without understanding Gaya. And there's, you know, one of the things that I tried to do in this book is, of course, I need to deal with, you know, the legends and mythology, but then there's been a flood of scholarship over the course of, you know, the last 40, 50 years, a lot of archaeology.
That's the thing about this period, is there was a lot of controversy and different opinions on how things go. But as to the book itself, one thing that's really nice about the book, and this is the best page in the whole book, but this isn't the only page. There are a lot of really nice photographs.
Yeah. I wanted to be able to show just there's so much great relics. There's so many, there's so many wonderful things that, and I'll, fortunately there's so much of, good photographs that were available online that we were able to, we needed to get have museum quality photos. Most of the photos here are from the National Museum in Gyeongju, then the National Museum in Seoul, and then a number of my own photographs that were of good enough quality. It's a rich little resource to understand kind of what I think of as the main thrust of things that are going on, politically and culturally and in religion during this period.
I have three responses to this book in that regard, and that is that it's very concise and puts it all in one place that's quite easy to read. But there are places where it's begging for more. You want to know more. And you have articles on almost every other thing in here, and there's other places you could go.
Right.
That's one thing. The second thing is I categorize this book as pearls and silk threads. And what I mean by that is there are lots of little pearls in here, little things that I hadn't known about. And you tell stories that come out of the Samguk Yusa and the Samguk Sagi and Chinese sources and Japanese sources where you tell of different incidences, and many of which I didn't know about. For example, the Korean hostage, the Silla hostage in Japan, who was rescued, and he got out, but his rescuer got killed in the process.
Yeah.
What a story, I mean, that's a movie. And
there should be a drama. No, it should be a drama about this.
Yeah, there should. Anyway, there are lots of pearls. There are lots of little things that, although I know this history, I've studied it, somewhat, but there are lots of little things along the way that, there's a gem, there's a gem, there's another one. And then the other thing is silk threads. I see threads here where it comes to the present, it connects,
Right.
And there are lots of those in here.
Well, absolutely. And in part, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when Korea when its engagement with the West, when it was rethinking its relationship with China, when the Japanese colonial promoters were pushing their vision of Korea isn't a country, it's a location. It's not an actor of history. It just history is acted upon it by other people, and Koreans were responding. This period has been incredibly studied, and it is incredibly important to what are known as sort of it's Minjok Sahak, right? These are the nationalist historians, people like Shin Chaeho and Chae Sun. They went to this period to find the essence of Korea, and so these are the things that Korean people know about. Many of these stories, and trying to this is where Koreans look, and the Hwarang are an example. For many people like Shin Chaeho, they didn't like Kim Bushik because they saw him as a
sellout.
Well, they saw him as the sort of as a Confucian, but even more than a Confucian, as a person who pushed this idea that we need to serve China. Many people have defended Kim Bushik afterwards, and I am a defender of Kim Bushik.
I love Kim Bushik. He's wonderful.
Well, and of course, this has to do with a lot of things, because it's Shin Chaeho he has some complicated feelings, because on the one hand, he sees the essence of Korea coming from Tangun, and then down through Buyeo and Old Chosun, but the heart of it being preserved in Goguryeo, which is very much like what happened when I first got involved with Korean studies back in the 1990s. There was a book that came out called Goguryeo. I don't know if you remember this. And there was even a, Sotejiwa Aida. Soteji and the boys had a rock song called Pare를 궁금요. And there was this, as Korea was emerging, as the democracy and the economy and Korea was becoming one of the advanced nations, there was a sense of, if Goguryeo had reunified the three kingdoms, then things would be different, right? And there's been that sense. And Shin Chaeho is definitely one of the people who is a promoter of that thing. And yet, on the other hand, in his writings, and I know about this from my current project, dealing with the Hwarang Segi manuscripts, Shin Chaeho, he saw the Hwarang as preserving. Now, Shin Chaeho is a definition of Sunbi, which we usually think of as scholars and Confucians, which is very different from but he claims that there was a Sunbi tradition in Goguryeo where they wore black robes and other kinds of stuff, and that this was copied by Shilla's Hwarang, and that the Koreanness
is really from Goguryeo.
The Koreanness is preserved in the Hwarang, and and what's interesting in his writings, he labels as a Hwarang faction people who were enemies of Kim Bushik at court, and of course the big watershed date is 1135. Now this is after this time period, but this is the time where you have the Myochung revolt and Kim Bushik is sent up there. But this, through him, the idea of conquering the north and holding that land is important, and anybody who's an enemy of Kim Bushik is a hero to him. And it's confusing because you can't find, these are terms that he has made up, but to him, what makes Korea is preserved in the Hwarang, and yet the Hwarang are from the state that he, in some sense, sees sold out the most, right? So, because he doesn't view people, Shin Chaeho at least doesn't view Kim Bushik, and then people like Kim Yu-shin and Kim Chun-chu and the early kings of the Silla period, he sees them as people selling out. It's how Korea became Korea in some ways. So,
well, the terminology of the North-South dynasties, the first North-South dynasties, and the idea, I grew up saying unified Silla. I said this in front of you a while back, and you winced a little bit because that's not the current term. We say greater Silla these days.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and I opted now in scholarship in Korea today. Art historians primarily stick with unified Silla. Many historians, they will talk about a middle and late Silla. So the middle period of Silla is primarily what we can think of as sort of the Kim Chun-chu dynasty, from, depending on whether you want to start at 668 or 676, all the way up to 780, when King Haegong when he is killed by other members of his family, and then there's the rest of the Silla period from 780 to the fall, as you have different parts of the Silla family competing for the throne, right? Many historians, at least the historians whose scholarship I like, they go back to Kim Bushik and this middle and late period. So even though I have big problems with Lee Jong-wook, who used to be historian at Sogang University, president,
and a good friend of mine,
he presented this idea of Tae Silla, right, greater Silla, and at least for an English audience, I think that's correct. I use that, but then I refer to middle and late, and I refer to these different terms. But as I'm a specialist of Silla, and I'm an unrepentant lover of Silla, which is not necessarily popular in Korea. But to me, Korea, Korean culture derives from Silla, because the language we have, so much of the culture, the information that we have so much more about Silla than we do anything else.
Well, I play the Silla song all the time. To my point of view, the thing I've been talking about is the peaceful thread throughout Korean history that goes counter to what most Koreans think about their own history. But this is not a peaceful time. The peaceful time comes really more after. Well, the late Silla is not so bad, but early Silla, there's a lot of warfare going on. I see the Silla trend as part of the main thrust of Korean history, the Silla, Goguryeo, Chosun. In fact, I see that as basically one dynasty, because there weren't any real revolutions that displaced the aristocracy from Goguryeo, from Silla to Goguryeo, and Goguryeo to Chosun.
The way I talk about Silla, it's a conquest dynasty, and there were individuals who wanted to be part of that, and that's part of the problems that Silla had, is because if it had perhaps diversified and brought more people into the ruling structure, then perhaps things would have endured. But because it didn't, right, and then there was this ossified control by people with the surname Kim at the top, they sowed the seeds of their own demise. And these, some of my own scholarship that I draw upon for this book kind of brings that out. And when you look at, there's a number of kinds of things where you can see continuation of Goguryeo culture. For instance, the use of ondol heating in the palaces and other things like that.
When I went to Shenyang and visited the palace of the early Qing dynasty, I was shocked to see they had ondol heating up there.
Yeah.
So their coverage of Baekje was really interesting to me. The interconnections between the three kingdoms and China and Japan was interesting, and the use of hostages. And I wonder at times if hostage is the wrong word for this, because they weren't locked up in a basement somewhere.
No.
These hostages had a great deal of diplomatic status. They were almost ambassadors.
One way that I talk with my students about trying to understand early Korean history, a lot of it is about controlling the area where present-day Seoul is.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And
whoever controlled
that land,
whether it was
Baekje was dominant when they controlled that part, but then when they lost it to Goguryeo was dominant.
And then Silla took it over.
And then when Silla and Baekje got together to take that part back, and then Silla beat them so that they could have access to China, right?
Yeah.
Then Silla became ascendant for a while. And so part of it has to do with the language. And this is part of the problem, right? When we look, Shilla's relationship with China was extremely beneficial. Of course, it all depends on what you think is or is not beneficial, right?
It's all subjective.
It's quite subjective. So Silla had people who were relatives. Some of these were sons of the ruling king or high-ranking aristocrats. They had these sinecure positions serving in the kind of in the court as part of the royal bodyguard of the Tang emperor, but they actually didn't do anything. They were this was like a stipend, and they went to school and they were involved. And so Silla always had, for a good while in the 650s and the 660s, they had the ear, right? They were close there, and they could, and of course, when you make powerful enemies, you need some friends. During those early years, one of Kim Chun-chu's sons, who was the younger brother of, this is Kim In-moon, whose grave is in Gyeongju. He was a very important individual. And when there was misunderstandings between Tang and Silla during the 670s, they actually wanted to depose King Munmu and stick his brother on the throne.
They knew him.
And they knew him, of course. But then, Silla was able to, ameliorate the situation. And of course, what's interesting is we wouldn't know about these struggles if it weren't for the Korean records, because in the Chinese records, they completely expunge all of this.
Especially when they lost along the way. Let's cover a couple of curiosity items I've got. The way you handled Yuktupum was a revelation to me, because I'd always learned Sungol, Chingol, Yuktupum, 654-321, commoner, slave. But you've got the lower head ranks as commoners and slaves.
Yeah, well, here's the reality is there is no mention in any of the records that we have of, the Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa mention, Sungor, they mention the Holy Bone, and they mention True Bone, and they mention head rank 6, but they don't mention anybody after that.
Not even below 5 or 4.
They don't mention, there's nobody in the Samguk Sagi who is called a Odupum. There's nobody head rank 5.
Interesting. And
so there is an individual, right, that they, I think there's an individual, and I didn't have it in here because there wasn't the space to do that. There is like an individual that some scholars think is maybe head rank 5, but he's not labeled that way. Mm-hmm. But, this is a person who was a commoner. What we mean by commoners, I think, the way to kind of look at this is you have individuals, right, that are capital-based elites, right? Mm-hmm. Capital-based, I like to use the word nobles instead of aristocrats for some reason. Mm-hmm. And then, and of course, definitely, the Holy Bones are a royal family, right? And then the Jingol are parts of the royal family and other elites, right? Yeah. And then you have, and then head rank 6 seem to be people who were, these are people that come from enough wealth, and they have surnames that are different from the dominant families, mm-hmm. right? Dominant from the, from the dominant Kims. Mm-hmm. they seem to be regional elites, right, in their local areas. Like the Sul family is from the area near where, in present-day Gyeongsan, in between Daegu and Gyeongju. That's where Wonhyo was born, right? And he was of that Sul family. And then other people are probably, seem to be underneath that, but we don't know anything about them.
You mentioned prominent Yuktupum families, and you mentioned Sol.
So there's the Che family, like Che Chi-wan.
And Che, Sol Chong and Che Chi-wan, and the Yi family goes back to that, and the Chung.
Yeah.
But there's also, of the Yuktupum, of the Yukpuchon, of the 6 villages, there are these 4 plus Pe and Son.
Well, the interesting thing is, okay, if you look at the epigraphy, and we have more epigraphy from Silla than we do from any of the, Baekje and Goguryeo combined. And we have epigraphy from the 6th century. They never mention surnames.
Yeah, that's an interesting
surnames
thing
are not mentioned.
Yeah.
And it seems likely that surnames only started to get used in the late 6th century. And of course, this is when the 17 rank capital, the capital rank system is being, it's continuing to grow. And in separate scholarship, and other, some of my Korean colleagues have different views, but we tend to agree that it evolved over time. Of course, the idea of having a rank system, they get it from Goguryeo. Baekje does a version. Early Japan, the Yamato state has a version, and Silla has a version as well. And it evolves, and you get higher and higher ranks as we move on, as we get into the later period. And this seems to be when the surnames begin to appear. Now, the other complicated thing, if you pay close attention to the Samguk and the Samguk one of the things that I talk about as it's a lost civilization, a big no-no in the East Asian world, in Sinitic culture, is marrying a close relative with the same surname.
Yeah,
well,
but that's all they did.
That's what they did. And one of my arguments, one of the ideas that I put forward, and when you read it, to me, I actually think that the Pak surname was created to give to
the Chinese an impression.
The impression that they're not marrying their cousins with the same surname.
Well, and if somebody loves the Hyakose myth, they're going to be a little bit disappointed in what you say.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is I've built upon if you like the Hyakose myth, but the interesting thing is there's no evidence that anybody, we have epigraphy from Buddhist monks and other people who had the surname Pak, and that is not mentioned in epigraphy with people with the surname Kim, whether it's what becomes the Gyeongju Kim or the Kimhae Kim. They recognize our ancestors were kings. But the Paks, even in the late Goguryeo, the late Silla, there's no mention of there being kings. And in other records, the idea about Pak Hyakose doesn't come out until right around the time that the Samguk does.
Really?
And then we start seeing the idea of Pak Hyakose appearing in epigraphy, particularly funerary inscriptions.
I've got one final theme to talk about, and that's one thing I've been working on lately, and that's early literacy. A friend of mine has shown me it's a metal movable type that predates the Chikji. And it occurs to me that metal movable type is not the important thing. Well, let me say it this way. I criticize the Sungyunguan for not claiming to be 1,000 years old. The Sungyunguan could very easily claim roots in the Goryeo period. But you have a school in Silla that started even earlier than that.
Tang Dynasty histories mention something called a Gyeongdang, that where Goguryeo, where what we think from the few lines that are about this, that Goguryeo warriors that were in the fortresses, when they had them studying something, and there's a basic curriculum, right, and which includes Chinese classics, some of the histories. Eventually, you get to the Wenxuan, the literary selections of literature, and you get that in Silla as well. We know we have certain dates when things were done, and then of course in 682, King Shinmun institutes this school, right? He institutes the Gukak, in Silla. And what's really interesting is that, and this is some of my own research that I've been doing recently, we, right around this time period when Silla is making connections with Tang, they are getting examples of good writing. And then when you move into the early 8th century, in the early 8th century, and King Shinmun is sending and asking for certain kinds of things, and with their skills in writing literary Chinese, what we see in the epigraphy, because we don't have other things, is the skills, even from the late 7th century, in the funerary inscriptions from the grave of King Munmu and Kim In-moon, they are showing a very sophisticated understanding of historical allusions and the use of various kinds of, just the use of Chinese literature, a knowledge of Chinese literature. And then when you get to the Divine Bell of King Sungda,
oh yeah,
that text shows that, it has a poem at the end. It's written. They're using the kind of prose that was being written in China, where you have alternating sounds. It's tonal prosody.
You're talking about the poem.
I'm talking about the poem written on that bell, which is 4 characters, which is the kinds of poems that are written in the Shiji. And so it's hundreds of years before the Japanese being able to do anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of mind-blowing. It's, we have, what makes me sad as a Koreanist is in Japan, they have a ton of stuff left over. And we wouldn't have what we have about East Asian Buddhism. In China and Korea, it's just not preserved. Fortunately in Japan, so many texts from China and Korea are preserved in Japan. But Koreans had in the Silla period, they had a very sophisticated knowledge, and they were participating at a very sophisticated level when it comes to literacy. Now, can we say everybody? No, but definitely they had a certain number of people.
You talk about the relationship between Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism in here. And I think, again, on this theme of education and the history of education, we think of it as a Confucian theme, certainly through the Chosun, certainly through the Goguryeo period. But there's a strong Buddhist textual study.
Yeah.
In fact, the Buddhists had this division in Buddhism over textual or meditative, and Chino put them together. So the textual basis of learning Buddhism goes way back. So this is another aspect of the educational depth of
absolutely
of Korea, going back into the Silla period.
Yeah, one of the things in making this book, one of the things that was both hard but then also easier, right, is I had to limit myself to a certain number of thousands of words per chapter. I can tell
in each chapter you want to talk more, but you have to move on.
Right. And of course that's what I like about it. Let's give them a flavor, and then you can dive into some other things. And especially when it comes to religious traditions, there's so much more. I'm just barely scratching the surface.
Yeah.
And books that we actually have, we have more books dealing with Buddhism, most of which were preserved in Japan.
Mm.
There's more things from the Goguryeo period that were preserved in Korea, and of course the Chosun period. But the earliest stuff, the stuff from Silla, most of it,
the Japanese wanted that. They've got it. They've preserved it.
Right, and and not only that, people continue to read these great Silla Buddhist thinkers for hundreds of years afterwards.
Mm.
And so it gives a very different take on this, the thing that's very popular about, Japan thinking itself. No, they viewed these greats, the great thinkers from Silla were long important in Japan.
And they loved the Baekje scholars as well. But we probably should make an end of this, but you just dropped an interesting hint just a second ago. You said you're working on the Hwarang Segi. Are you going to really get into that one?
Well, I've finished making an annotated translation of the Hwarang Segi manuscript.
We'll have to save Hwarang Segi for the next episode when we have some time. That'll be interesting. And it's interesting for me because Lee Jong-uk's a very good friend of mine. He has a very different point of view on
I've read all of his scholarship. I understand his point of view, but my opinion is that
we'll hear about that next time. In the meantime, Go get your copy of The Three Kingdoms of Korea, Lost Civilizations. You'll enjoy it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Thanks, Rick, for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.